The Japanese were threatened by the Americans, thinking that the Americans were trying to steal their resources. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. This was also the day that America joined World War II. After this bombing, things in America were very tense. All Japanese Americans in the US were then looked at differently. Everyone thought that they were spies and that they were there to help Japan further. Very shortly after the bombing, the Order 9066 was passed on March 21, 1942. This order was basically placed on all Japanese Americans to America from espionage by putting the Japanese Americans into labor camps where they had to work factory jobs and farms all behind barbed wires. The camps were crammed with many internees, meaning long lines to many things such as bathrooms and cafeterias. This led to many people trying to get out of their neighborhood communities and decreased the likelihood of being placed into the camps. Due to the sheer amount of people being placed into camps, they needed temporary locations such as stables and large facilities to house them for short amounts of time before they were moved to another location. The people in the camps did earn wages for what they worked. The average adult could have made $5 a day. This was in hopes that the camps could become self-sufficient. The camps had minimal violence when it came to internees. It came to the form of internees trying to flee the camps with the total death of 3 deaths.
The camps were created very quickly by Theodore Roosevelt. He cleared the 9066 order, which was the order that basically said that anyone who had a little bit of Japanese in them was ordered to leave their homes and their stuff and report to these camps. Even if they were born in America, they still had to report to these camps. In fact, more than 2/3 of the people who were interned were American citizens. They weren't allowed to leave the country or disobey the order. There were a few who disobeyed and they were punished with jail, beatings, extra labor, etc. The order was only passed for those who lived on the West Coast and along the Pacific Coast. This was because the government believed that they were spies and reporting back to Japan with new information. So they were relocated so that they couldn't report back to Japan, though almost all of them were innocent and just in the US to restart and have better chances for them and their kids. This is not what they were met with. The Japanese Americans were given anywhere from 4 days to 2 weeks to settle, jobs, money, houses, and gather as much as they could carry, but they had to get rid of everything else. That includes their houses, furniture, animals, jobs, cars, and whatever else they owned. There ended up being a total of 10 internment camps across the West Coast with about 120,000 people forced into them. The 10 camps were located in California, Arizona, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and Arkansas. Before the camps were enforced, there was a curfew for all Japanese Americans. If they broke out or broke it in any way, they were arrested. So then Roosevelt signed Order 9066 in hopes to help that problem.
At the different camps, all the prisoners were forced to work long and hard hours. They got up when it was still dark outside and got right to work. Everybody worked, including the children. They started working at around age 10, and if they weren't at school, they were working. Everyone worked until it was dark outside and time for dinner. The adults made less than $5 a day, and the kids didn't even make anything. There are pictures of women working in the War Department making camouflage nets for World War II. They were forced to work there all day, and if they didn't work, they were forced to do more labor. The kids were forced to go to school, though there weren't a lot of schools. There were rooms without chairs and barely any tables where they were forced to learn. They lacked the materials they needed, and all the kids who were ever in a camp were forced to learn like that. The duration that they were there, that's exactly how the school stayed. None of the guards or anyone cared how they learned. Why were the camps created, you might ask? They were created out of fear. Shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Order 9066 was passed. All Japanese Americans were forced into camps. The order was passed before all the camps were finished being created, so a lot of families were placed in temporary camps that were more awful than the camps themselves. They were severely cramped up. If a baby started crying at night, then it would wake everyone up because everyone was in such close proximity. The bathrooms at the temporary camps were described to be disgusting pits with very poor sanitation and stenches. The apartments were then quickly built, but with little room due to such a rush. They ended up having 24 people living in a room made for 4 people. That explains how cramped it was. The apartments had external showers, bathrooms, and laundry rooms. This allowed them to fit more people into the rooms, and the government didn't need to make more camps and buildings to house more people. They had very little insulation, which was awful when it comes to winter, and the heat
It made it extremely cold during the winter and during the summer. There was no ventilation, making it very hot. Making it very hot caused many to get hypothermia and hot flashes, making even sleeping dangerous at camps. The weather was often very unfavorable due to the area the camps were built. They were made mostly in desert-like areas where the weather became very difficult to live in. They would be very uncomfortable to live and sleep. Cold winters and hot summers made these nights even worse than were due to sheer amount of people in one apartment. It increased the overall temperature in the building. The buildings themselves had no insulation installed because they were made low-budget buildings. The Japanese Americans themselves started to make their own food even out the poor and dry desert dirt. They would raise their own livestock to make food and give them some sense of homeliness. They made their own clothing to create extra layers of warmth to protect them from the cold during the winter. A popular thing that people did in the camps was playing baseball. This was a way for the prisoners to have some fun and retain some sort of normalcy while behind barbed wire. Baseball was also a big part of the American culture. During the drafting of World War II, President Roosevelt wrote a letter to the Major League Baseball's commissioner, urging him to continue to keep the games going even if some of his players were drafted. Roosevelt felt that with the game still going, it would give people a pastime and break tension from the war. With the Japanese Americans playing, it gave them something to pass the time, but also assert their identities as Americans and in the American culture. They had over 80 teams formed over 7 of the total 10 camps. Only 4 permitted to travel to other camps and teams with games being played every day. Another thing they had to pass time was Boy and Girl Scouts. Other American sports teams such as softball, football, basketball, boxing, volleyball, tennis, badminton, and golf. They had a few traditional Japanese sports such as karate, sumo, and judo. Reasons being that with all the diseases and illnesses, there were no vaccines or cures, and the only form of healthcare that they had were nurses in the camps. They weren't given any doctors or healthcare providers. Due to the poor food environments, it caused a lot of food poisoning, and due to the desert, it caused asthma. A total of 1,862 people died from medical problems. About 1 in every 10 people that died from medical problems died from tuberculosis. Tuberculosis was a major cause of death in the camps, and that was probably due to poor breathing conditions and the fact that they had no vaccines for any sort of disease. They had no immunity to it, so it just spread like a wildfire. The keepers and guards that kept control of all prisoners kept them working even though they were quite literally dying and could barely work. They didn't care what the conditions they were in as long as they got their work done. They even started working kids while they were pretty young and get vaccinated before being placed into the assembly centers in order to not spread any diseases throughout the assembly centers. The internees realized how important the vaccinations were and the prevention of disease when they were placed at the assembly centers in unsanitary conditions. These assembly centers were placed where racetracks and fairgrounds used to be. Some unlucky families were placed in stables that had been bleached but still smelled bad. These assembly centers didn't have many resources needed for the families who lived there. The physicians and the other doctors were limited to supplies they brought from home, and when those supplies ran out, they had to wait for the government to send more supplies which wouldn't arrive promptly, which led to the patients having to wait days until they could be taken care of. After their temporary stay at the assembly centers, the families were moved to the internment camps. At Camp Manzanar Relocation Center. That is where the first Japanese American died and got buried ever at any of the camps. The one then turned into hundreds and more. There is no absolute no number of graves at the camp, but we do know there was a lot. Most of the casualties were caused by diseases, famine, and illnesses. At the camps, they didn't have proper healthcare, housing, hygiene, food, or clothing. This all contributed to how many casualties there ended up being. The camps represented social injustice because if you were Japanese at the time, you were shunned by society. You were automatically judged and had no chance. You were seen as a spy and people feared you. The bombing of Pearl Harbor was a great scare to America. It was one of the first attacks straight to America in a while. It really shook a lot of people, so President Roosevelt was forced to act. When the president signed for Order 9066, Congress all voted for it. There wasn't one vote against it, which is another example of extreme social injustice. The camps officially ended on January 2nd, 1945. The camps were enforced for about 3 years in total. They ended because of the new election. Once they were let go, they might have been freed, but they were still met with segregation. They faced physical violence and opposition. There was also a severe job and home shortage due to the fact that 120,000 people finally returned home and all needed somewhere to live and needed some sort of income. There were some people who were fortunate enough to return to jobs, homes, farms, or whatever else they previously owned, but not everyone was that lucky. The internment camps ended up being a big part of World War II in the US, but close to no one knew about them or remember them. They were one of the things forgotten in US history, though to this day there are some people still alive around California and in California that were placed in the internment camps when they were children. This time was very hard for Japanese Americans, not just in the camps, outside of the camps, what was very difficult too. People faced violence, racism, and more. Some people even got killed because the US was so scared of them.